All right. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today. This will be a video version of our Brazilian politics podcast. And the idea is to have a somewhat informal discussion on Brazilian politics and the current scenario, especially in light of the coronavirus crisis. Now, some of the topics that we will discuss here are based on questions that we have already received from clients, but feel free to send in any additional questions throughout the discussion and we'll do our best to address them. Before the introductions, I'd like to make a quick disclaimer on an email that was sent related to this webinar. Like many people out there, we're still figuring out this video conferencing software situation. So an email was mistakenly sent to saying that this would be the interview with the president of the Federal Supreme Court, Dias Toffoli. Just as a reminder, that already occurred earlier this week. And in fact, we have several interviews with key decision makers coming up as well. We had former President of the Republic, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, yesterday for our clients and special guests. And we will have an interview with former President Michel Temer and an interview with the leader of the government in Congress, Senator Eduardo Gomes, next week as well. So please stay tuned for that. I'm Michael Lopez. I'm joined here by Lucas Aragão and Thiago Aragão. We are partners of Arko Advice, which is the leading public affairs firm in Brazil, a firm that has nearly 40 years of experience in the sector. We have offices in São Paulo, Brasilia, Rio, and Washington, D.C. Our Washington, D.C. office is headed by Mr. Thiago Aragão, who's present here. And for well over a decade, the three of us have helped companies, investors, funds, multinationals navigate the complex Brazilian landscape. At Arko, we specialize in political risk analysis, legislative and regulatory monitoring, sector intelligence, crisis management, among other things as well. So sorry for that lengthy introduction. How are you guys doing today, Lucas and Thiago? All good?
All good. Thank you, Michael.
All good. Thank you.
All right. So I think it'd be useful for us to start this discussion with just an overview of the current situation in Brazil, a look at the coronavirus infections and the healthcare system. So just to get things started, according to our most recent official numbers, which are currently on the official website of the Ministry of Healthcare, we have over 13,700 cases confirmed with 667 deaths, which represents a mortality rate of almost 5%. So I'd like to direct this first question to you, Thiago. What are the specific characteristics of Brazil as a country that inform this current coronavirus crisis?
Well, thank you, Michael. Well, as most of our guests or every one of our guests are aware, Brazil is a large country, it's a continental country with a very different demographics throughout the country. So evaluating Brazil as a whole, we might have sometimes a more mild view of what is going on if compared to specific regions of the country. Now, when we look at São Paulo is going through a very complicated moment in dealing with the coronavirus. More than a little bit over half of the deaths in Brazil are occurring in the state of São Paulo. And the difficulty there is not only the demographics and the large population, but it reflects a difficulty that sooner or later will expand to other parts of the country. So in Brazil right now, we are in a chronology compared to other countries slightly behind. So perhaps this is why the numbers are still similar to the numbers that we had in the United States, for example, 3 weeks ago or a month ago. So Brazil is a continental country. Brazil, we have a public health system, which is the largest public health system in the world for a country over 100 million inhabitants. So our public health system is relatively efficient in dealing with mild situations in a day-to-day. But right now, there's a big question mark whether it's going to be able to handle the coronavirus or not, since it's notorious to many Brazilians about the difficulties that they have in having the basic equipment to perform specific things. In Brazil, we are also suffering a lot of speculation and some evidence is popping here and there of underreporting. And this is a critical issue in order to apply severe and strong policies in relation to the containment of the crisis. And what can give us an indication of this underreporting, apart from the cases itself, which are popping up in the press, is the fact that very few tests have been made in Brazil. We have made approximately 60,000 tests, which represents 0.5% of the expected number of tests that the Ministry of Health wanted to conduct in the country. So naturally, the underreporting is also linked to the fact that very few tests are being made in the country.
Thank you for that, Thiago. It's clearly all over the world. I mean, we're all facing this difficult scenario, but I think it's safe to say that the Brazilian government has been very active in trying to deal with this crisis along many fronts, and not only the government, but Congress, the judiciary, and the state level and municipal level as well. So I'd like to go through some of the policy responses to this virus, which I've grouped together in three different groups. I think first we have the fiscal response, which is incredibly important given that Brazil throughout the Bolsonaro administration had been laser focused on a fiscal austerity effort that quickly became derailed. So on the fiscal side, we have a declaration of public calamity, which was approved by Congress, is effective until the end of the year, and the government is not forced to meet fiscal targets that it had for this year. There's also a war budget constitutional amendment, which was approved in the lower house. It's now under the Senate. And it allows government to spend more freely without some of the constitutional limitations. As far as the healthcare, there have been a multitude of measures. I'll just mention some of them, which are securing of ICU beds, increase in doctors with the More Doctors program, simplification of authorization procedures to increase key product supplies, credit lines for medical equipment, work from home policies for companies and civil servants, restrictions to travel and business operations, where it's important to note these are decisions that are made at the state level, and we'll get back to that in a second, as well as restriction of entry of foreigners into the country. And then with regards to the economy and workers, we have the creation of a monthly benefit payment, which has become known as the Corona Voucher, for low-income brackets and informal workers. And just as an aside, as of last night, in just about a day, over 18 million informal workers had signed up for this voucher program. We also have early payment of end-of-year bonuses, FGTS withdrawals, increases to the Bolsa Familia program, credit loans for payroll for companies, authorized reduction of working hours and salaries, tax postponements, historically low interest rates, and a general effort to increase credit supply to stimulate the economy. Now, like I mentioned a bit before, all of these policies depend on different parts of the government. In some, the central bank is involved, Congress is involved, specifically with constitutional amendments, but so are states. And I think one of the main questions right now are the social distancing policies, which are the realm of the states, and they allow us to enter a discussion into this federative issue. So Lucas, I'd like to pass this question on to you, but could you tell us about the relationship between the federal government now and states during this pandemic? There's been some obvious tension, possibly with some electoral undertones. So could you discuss this situation for us, please?
Hi, Michael. Hi, Thiago. Hello, everyone watching us today. There's an obvious tension, and I wouldn't even say that it's exclusive to the presidency and the governors. I think there's a general institutional tension in Brazil today between the government and the Congress, the government and the states, the government and the Ministry of Health, in some moments, other actors as well, the judiciary. However, I think that this will be a crisis, at least on the medical side, on the humanitarian side, that will be decided by two lines. The example part of, I would say three parts. The example part of President Bolsonaro in the executive branch, despite the way that he has been handling the coronavirus situation, not being popular among Brazilians, according to the recent polls, the Ministry of Health has been well evaluated. This creates a paradox because they have had many different lines of approach in these recent weeks, especially regarding social distancing, the use of the chloroquine as a medicine to combat the coronavirus. I believe that the three lines of how this will be the reaction to the problem is that first we will have the narrative part, which Bolsonaro impacts tremendously by example, the part of the Ministry of Health setting the guidelines, but at the end of the day, the social distancing, the quarantine, the opening of the commerce, the opening of movements in the streets will be mainly decided by the governors, and they are politicians. This is something that I have been saying to our clients here at Arko. The decision-making process will always be guided by science, by the medical numbers, by the medical guidelines. But at the end of the day, these guys are politicians, and they are starting to feel extremely pressured. We have elections for mayors in a few months. In 2 years' time, 2.5 years' time, we have the general elections. We have two very important states, Rio and São Paulo, with two governors that have national projection and want to have more national projection. We have the governor of Rio, Wilson Witzel, yesterday already opening commerce in certain cities, municipalities in the state of Rio de Janeiro that have not been hit by the coronavirus. Doria is suffering immense pressure from part of his electorate, especially the organized business community, to have a plan to leave the quarantine. But this shows this general tension of the federalism in Brazil. We have a long-standing general tension between states and the executive branch in Brazil, mainly because the states depend financially of the central government. We have a very unequal tax distribution in Brazil, with only 20-something being distributed to the states. And so I believe that this tension will continue. We had a conversation not long ago, maybe a few days ago, with the Secretary of Government, who told us that we have it was a source within the Secretariat of Government, who told us that today we have about 3 or 4 governors who are on Bolsonaro's side, that want to open commerce, that want to have a getting back to normal lifestyle. We have about 5 or 6 who are divided, and the rest are on the line of following the Ministry of Health, the World Health Organization. So this will only continue. I think we're moving into a direction where we will have even bigger tension between the states and the central government. And this has impacts in Congress. This has impact on the advance of the agenda in Congress, especially post-crisis. So I believe this is a moment that the power in Brazil has become even more diluted, more shared. We are seeing the governors having the right, the jurisdictional right, according to the Supreme Court, to make the decision regarding commerce. We're seeing Congress in the front seat of the decision-making process, and we see Bolsonaro trying to make part of this discussion, but often being shut down by this shared power that we're seeing in Brazil right now.
Thank you for that, Lucas. And I think it's especially fortuitous that you use the word shared, given our interview with former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso yesterday, where he began to describe what he believes to be the new form of Brazilian presidentialism, which for many years was based on a coalition-based system with multi-party coalitions, which has migrated to what former President FHC termed a shared presidentialism. So along those lines, I'd like to ask Thiago, Bolsonaro, since his election, he changed the rules of this coalition-based presidentialism. He did not form a large multi-party coalition and used other forms of support to back his government. So how do you see the executive's relationship with Congress during this pandemic, especially in light of Bolsonaro's rejection of the so-called old politics?
Well, the relationship right now between the presidential palace and the Congress is a continuation of the troubled relationship that we were seeing in Brazil over the last months before the coronavirus crisis. So this troubled relationship had several specific items of debate and of discussion between one side of the other, but mainly it was basically a dispute to occupy a specific perception that the other one had in relationship to the other in relation to a vacuum of power. So historically in Brazil, we see the Congress taking a stance and trying to set the agenda, leading the president or the presidential palace to a reactionary mode when they understand there is a ability or a possibility for them to increase their power capabilities during that particular situation. The other way around works as well. The presidential palace understanding that the high level of rejection that historically the Congress has enjoyed with the population gave them an opportunity for them to force an agenda upon the Congress based on the mindset of the design of the mindset coming from the presidential palace in order to have the Congress as an organ that would simply validate some of the continuous ideas of the presidential palace. Well, this particular debate from one side or the other was already occurring. And when the coronavirus hit, it adds a dramatic component to this relationship because the decisions right now, they must be fast. They must be in a total agreement. And this is not necessarily what we're seeing in 100% of the cases. For example, the decision of the governors to maintain the quarantine and the lockdown on a number of states is something that clearly President Bolsonaro has expressed in several occasions that he is against that. And he is so against that he already mentioned the possibility of, with the stroke of a pen, by a decree, forcing commerce to be open in Brazil and the quarantines to be seized. However, this relationship with the Congress, since it has not altered from the pre-coronavirus days, immediately led to a response from the main leaderships in the Congress, in which they indicated their intention that if this was to happen, if Bolsonaro took this decision, they would work on the procedures to reject this decree and to veto this decree, which is something not common in Brazilian politics in this level, but in which they exposed their weapons there. And this is a major symbol of this conflictuous relationship between the two sides, the two powers.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question on this that I'll direct at Lucas. But, you know, it's interesting because even without a governing coalition in the first year of the administration, Congress and the executive, they were aligned. You know, there was some personal tension between certain members of the government and certain parliamentarians, but overall they were all aligned in the need for structural reforms, especially pension reform, which a very robust version of pension reform was approved at the end of last year. And then there were high hopes for tax reform, administrative reform. It seemed like Congress was aligned on these issues. In this crisis, I think it's interesting. I think it was yesterday, Rodrigo Maia, the Speaker of the House, made a statement that he said that as of right now, the only thing that Congress and the executive are aligned on is the need to pass legislation to help fight the coronavirus and mitigate the economic effects of the coronavirus. So my question to you, Lucas, is would it be possible to return to a broader understanding like support for structural reforms after this crisis is surpassed?
Michael, and just to remind our viewers, we do have a Q&A session here on our broadcast. So if you have any questions, please click the Q&A, direct your questions, that at the end of the last 15, 20 minutes, we'll be answering these questions. Going back to yours, Michael, I think that the Congress and the executive, they found convergence on the economic agenda. I think the destruction of the economy, which was caused by the many years of recession, by the flawed economic policies of the Dilma administration, by the world crisis that hit in 2008, I think it created a general economic destruction in Brazil, which was negative for all the political class. When you add the moral, ethical crisis of the car wash operation, it was the perfect storm for authorities, congressmen like Bolsonaro to rise to power to president. We had a historic renewal in the National Congress in 2018. Number-wise, it was high. It tends to stay around 40, 45%. It reached over 50% in 2018. But we did see changes in the higher end of the pyramid of Congress, when normally the changes were in the lower end and people didn't quite feel this 40% renewal. So I think that the government, with its more economically liberal agenda, which they defended in their defense, they defended it since the first day of their campaign, with Paulo Guedes going to the press, talking about the need to a pension reform. We had on top of that a Speaker of the House, Rodrigo Maia, who defended ideologically the pension reform as well. So I think there was this convergence of internal and external factors to the government that helped the economic agenda find a convergence in Congress. However, this alignment between the executive and the legislative have always had tense moments since day one. If we look back to the first year of administration, even in the pre-coronavirus situation, we had many situations where the government lost. Vetoes were revoked, which, as Thiago said, it's something that is not normal in the Brazilian politics system. Just as a historical data to our viewers, between 1995 and 2010, 2012, there were about 3,000, 2,000 vetoes in Congress that the Congress had never taken a look at. They started to review these vetoes when President Dilma started antagonizing the Congress. And then they started looking to vetoes. And in 2013, vetoes began to block the agenda. So now when there's a veto, they have to look at it, or else nothing else can be looked at. So now they are obliged to take a closer look to the vetoes, which creates tension, especially in a government that lacks a natural alignment with Congress. So in this year, we've had vetoes revoked. We had provisional measures that lost their validity. The provisional measure that rearranged the ministerial staff of the government, which created the Ministry of Economy, putting together other ministries as well, that deleted some other ministries, created others. It was approved on the last day of its validity, on a Monday. If that hadn't been approved, it would be an administrative managerial mess to the government. So I think the government found convergence with the reformist agenda, with the economic freedom provisional measure, with the pension reform, but they never had a coalition. They never had 200 plus congressmen, 250 plus congressmen in Congress that were willing to fight their battles. And this becomes difficult for a government to advance its agenda. They can only advance when it's a high-end issue, either because there's enough convergence or because the streets and social media are pressuring for it. But there's much more than that. And there's not enough excitement from society to press and to pressure the Congress for all the multiple agendas that this government have. I think that looking forward, we will continue to see the same thing. If the government wants to find success with the Congress, there's only two ways. One, either they will find convergence of issues, they will find issues that the Congress agree with, or two, social media and press will organize themselves and create such pressure that will make the Congress uncomfortable, and they will have to approve such issues. This second variable, the pressure, it's a tool that you can use every once in a while. So now the government will have to find convergence, because if they don't find convergence, the Congress will have no power, no problem using their weapons, as Thiago put, which is revoking vetoes, revoking decrees, rejecting provisional measures. So we have reached a point where who is driving the car of the agenda in Brazil is the Congress. The government has to look at the car and see, well, do I want to sit down on this agenda or not? And this will be the way to advance with convergence.
Thank you for that, Lucas. It's definitely a complicated answer, but I think it addresses the first question that we received in our Q&A segment. So thank you for that. Now, I'd like to move a little into a discussion of a broader political scenario of the executive itself. We know that the presidency is not just Bolsonaro. We have the presidential cabinet, the different ministries, and there are a lot of different dynamics at play in the decision-making internally in the Planalto Palace and in the other cabinet offices as well. The clashes with Mandetta, the Minister of Healthcare, have been widely publicized. There is other turmoil. So, Thiago, I'd like to direct this to you, and Lucas, feel free to chime in as well. But what are the different groups that are acting inside of the executive? Who are the key players? People like Mandetta, like the Chief of Staff, General Braga Neto. What is the true dynamics of the decision-making in the executive?
Well, Michael, you know, and me, you, and Lucas, we have over the past year or so spoken with several individuals in the presidential palace and the Ministry of Economy precisely to understand this decision-making process. This decision-making process in the government, first of all, conceptually, it follows a specific recipe that we can see this repeated in several occasions. So basically what we have is when a fact arrives to the level of the presidential decision, or when a situation such as the coronavirus presents itself, what we have is first the personal understanding of the president towards the fact. Following that, what we see is the reactions of his close advisors. And who are these close advisors? Above anything else, you have the family, you have his 3 sons, Senator Flavio, Representative Eduardo, and Carlos, who is a representative in the City Council of Rio de Janeiro. They have a lot of influence in this decision-making of the president. But following the reactions of the close circle, particularly the family, towards the presidential positioning of a fact, what we have following that is the involvement to a higher or lesser degree of the military advisors and other opinion makers which are circumstantial depending to the topic. These could be the Congress, these could be sectorial leaderships in the private sector, and they give their response and their reactions towards the initial understanding of the president. Following that, the decision-making goes back to a presidential decision with a balance between what the close advisors advocate for, what the major opinion makers, even if the opinion makers are literally advisors inside the palace, but not perhaps in the closest circle, plus the reaction of the press, of the social media, the temperature that is measured by the social media, and this goes back to a final decision made by Bolsonaro. When we look into a specific issue, what we have is President Bolsonaro, he trusts immensely a small group of people, which involves, as you said, General Braga Neto, the Minister of the Civil House, General Ramos, the Minister of the Secretariat of Government, the sons, the family around him. And depending on the topic, it could involve Paulo Guedes in the Ministry of Economy, Sergio Moro in the Ministry of Justice, or someone else.
I would add, Thiago, just to the military realm, I would add 2 names that are often outside of the normal stakeholder mapping that we see in the press, which is Admiral Flavio Rocha, who's the Secretary of Strategic Affairs.
Exactly.
And the Ministry of Defense, Fernando Azevedo. Although they're not in the hierarchy of the structure as people that are often directed as influencers of the presidency, they are friends. And this is something that Brazil, we always tell our clients, don't look at the organogram, look at the friendship. That's
exactly.
what lies.
And their
Yeah,
opinions
very
are
good
respected by Bolsonaro too.
They are. And we can also include, we must include in that General Heleno, the head of the Cabinet of Institutional Security and the Intelligence. So when the decision is made, these group of individuals, they are not decision makers. They are opinion makers, but they have a higher degree of influence over the president than anyone else. But the president, he is highly motivated in his decision based on open responses from social media, from the way that the press positions, whether he treats it to be fair or unfair, and how the Congress reacts itself. So within this combination of issues, plus historically we can see Bolsonaro giving a lot of value to his own political intuition, which has been a particular trait in his career, we can put all this together in a bowl, and we can identify basically how the ultimate decision making can come up, and how and why in many occasions the president turns back on a decision that he made, reevaluates the decision, and takes a different route. And the most recent example, when we were observing the possibility of the Minister of Health being fired over these past few days.
Yeah, and I would add to that example the kind of the changes in tone that we've seen from the official communication coming from the presidency.
Absolutely.
So very early on, we saw Bolsonaro be almost dismissive of this virus. He used words that were widely quoted throughout the press, both domestically and internationally, saying that it's just a small flu. But then we saw a national pronouncement where he seemed to be a bit more moderate in his views, a bit more accepting of the scientific community and the need for social distancing and the seriousness of the situation. And then recently we've seen somewhat of a rolling back of this understanding. And I think that leads me, it's a good segue to the next question, which is the public opinion of the presidency at this time. So I'd like Lucas, if you could please discuss with us the most recent polls. We had polls from Datafolha and XP Investments that brought some interesting information about increasing disapproval ratings among specific income brackets. What has led to this scenario, and then what are the political consequences of this?
Michael, as a context, let's go to where we're at in the last 14, 15 months of President Bolsonaro. Throughout last year, it became pretty consolidated that we had around 30% of people that gave him a good or great approval, according to the polls. We had a little over 30 something saying that he was doing a regular job. It was okay, neutral. And we had another 30 something saying that he was doing a terrible, poor job. This 30% of the negative, poor job will stay there ad eternum with President Bolsonaro. This is the people that reject him completely, that have, in some cases, I wouldn't say all of them, but that voted to the Workers' Party, the PT administration in 2018. It's very similar to the number of people that support politically President Lula, so they are in that box. The 30% that we've had of great good, it's obviously those that buy the entire Bolsonaro package, that like his narrative, like his confrontational style, and support him personally. And we have the people in the middle, who together with the people that think that he's doing a great job, form the most powerful force in Brazil right now of political sentiment, which is the anti-PT feeling. So this is the general context of where we're at. Bolsonaro, with love alone, wouldn't have been elected. As we all know, elections are more about hate than love. And the anti-PT feeling, the hate for the PT, projected Bolsonaro to become the president of Brazil. Where we're at right now, in the recent polls, he went down a little bit of those that consider that he's doing a great or good job. The regular also went down a little bit, and we had a bigger concentration of bad and terrible job, according to the recent polls. We have written this in our reports in the past few weeks. We have written many times that the biggest risk for Bolsonaro, because the coronavirus has become such a polarizing issue, vertical lockdown, horizontal lockdown, let's do this, let's do that, that the people in the middle could skew to people that think that he's doing a terrible job, while his protection, his buffer of great and good would be generally protected. This increases polarization in Brazil. This increases the tension in Brazil. I think Bolsonaro today, with 30% of approval, and let's say 25, 30%, or 25 of approval and 25, 30% of people that think that he's doing a regular job, that's a comfortable buffer for him. This is enough to keep the mandate. This is enough to be able to be viable into 2022. But there's still a long way to go. We still don't know exactly where these numbers will be after the coronavirus crisis. But my feeling is that we are moving to an even deeper polarization of society, where we will see Bolsonaro's 25, 30% comfortable, and the ones in the regular, in the middle, could skew a little bit to the bad and terrible job, making two very distinct sides in Brazil. I think this is the general picture of where we're at regarding his popularity.
I think that's very interesting, and it's a perfect segue into the next discussion, which is political polarization in the age of coronavirus. But I just wanted to make a quick point about what you said, which is that the numbers are shifting back and forth depending on specific events, and social media has been a very key indicator for Bolsonaro. So we saw immediate responses when it was ventilated that Bolsonaro could maybe fire Minister of Health Mandetta. And even among some supporters, the majority of social media kind of rallied in support of Mandetta, as did the financial markets as well. So I think it's something that the Bolsonaro administration is very aware of, and it's something that they use strategically, specifically social media, to organize their supporters and to give some momentum to narratives that fit in with their larger narratives. But just to finalize this discussion on polarization, I think, in many countries, we've seen that crisis scenarios tend to bring people together in support of a common enemy, right? In this case, the coronavirus. I think there are numerous historic examples of that happening. Situations like the September 11th in the US, where popularity increases for the leader and the nation kind of rallies around a specific enemy. But I agree with you, Lucas, that in this case, it seems that the different sides of the discussion have become even more entrenched in their ideas and unable to enter into honest and open-minded discussions with each other to find common ground.
And I think that an interesting aspect of this all is that the Workers' Party, the PT, the left, the opposition to this government in the most traditional way, has not been part of the conversation.
Yeah,
has not been part of the conversation. This has become a conversation of political tension between Bolsonaro, between the governor of São Paulo, João Dória, who tries to find a narrative for this third way that would break the polarization that we had in the last election. We have Witzel, the governor of Rio, that was a surprise in 2018, coming from a Christian party with no political background. So the polarization has now become in many dimensions, and it's not only a polarization between the PT and the Bolsonaro. Now you add the element of João Dória, the element of a newcomer like Witzel. And then you have Luciano Huck that could run for president in 2022.
And Lucas, part of the reason for that is that while we see the left very clearly defined of what it is and what it represents, and who are they? We don't see this in Brazil in the so-called right. So the right in Brazil is still forming itself because it's not something that we had over the previous years in Brazil. So this is why we see all these variations between those that used to be allies a year ago and right now breaking into subcategories, because they are still trying to identify the limitations of what means to be right in Brazil.
I think, and I think to be fair to the left, I think I definitely agree with you, Lucas, that there's a kind of an absence of a larger national leadership. But we definitely see in specific regions, like specifically with governors, there are many leftist governors in the Northeast that have been kind of voicing their opinions and being important political actors, but the absence is more nationally.
Yes, and I think this is because the PT made a very bold move 2-3 years ago of closing their eyes to reality. It was strategic. I understand that by betting on Lula since they won,
they put all their chips on.
They put all their chips, and they didn't create a newcomer. So now they're looking around and seeing who could run. We've tried Haddad. The Northeast, they have some popular governors. Bahia with Coutinho, Flávio Dino, which is not from the Workers' Party, but from the left in Maranhão, from the PCdoB, the Communist Party of Brazil. They're now trying to rebrand themselves. We have Camilo Santana, who's a more modern guy from Ceará, but they didn't put their bet on a name. While the PSDB, with all their problems, all their differences, all their shakiness from recent years, not being very clear what they wanted, they made a very quick cut from 2018 to here, completely putting Geraldo Alckmin on the freezer, as we say here in Brazil, and creating this alliance towards Doria, who is also a guy that suffers some credibility issues by his electorate because he was mayor and then he decided to step down to run for governor, who is hated by the Bolsonaristas because he supported Bolsonaro 2 years ago, and now he is one of his biggest oppositions. But without going to the merit of the PSDB, if they made right or wrong decisions, the PSDB is trying to create a candidate on Doria, while the PT is still fumbling with the free Lula, which now has lost a lot of its intensity because he's actually free. So I think the PT is searching for a narrative and searching mostly for a name.
I'd like to a great discussion. I'd just like to interrupt this to address another question that we got in the Q&A section. And this allows us to go back and talk a little more about the discussions in Congress and the Congress's existence post-crisis and their ability to pass fiscal reforms or return to the fiscal austerity efforts that they were engaged in before. But just as an update to our viewers, right now, social distancing policies are fully in place in the National Congress. We are functioning via a remote deliberation system, which is basically like an iPhone app that the parliamentarian logs into.
It's basically what we're doing now. And there has been funny moments in Congress this recent weeks with people not knowing their microphones were on.
Exactly.
Dogs and children in the background.
But so far, these discussions are just in the floor of the lower house and the floor of the Senate, and they're really only focused on coronavirus-related measures. We had the possibility of some progress with the Mansueto plan, which has proved to be somewhat difficult. But this question is for both of you, Lucas and Thiago. What can we expect from Congress once the crisis is surpassed, or at least once the remote deliberation system moves down into the permanent committees or the thematic committees, where we have the Economic Affairs Committee in the Senate holding public hearings, CPIs, we have all of the different committees dealing with the more specific issues, not necessarily related to coronavirus, and how does this huge spending spree that has become necessary with the coronavirus situation, how will the brakes be pumped on that, and how will Congress be able to move back into a fiscal austerity effort? Is that even possible?
Well, Michael, the sense of urgency around the Congress will be immense. And at the same time, what will control and dominate the agenda is are the attempts for the reaction of everything that was made during the coronavirus crisis. So basically, it will be a responsive behavior from the Congress in terms of trying to adjust things and trying to put things back into place before start thinking of moving forward again. The main problem that we have seen in the Congress over not only now, but over the past years, and which is also one of the main items of concerns of the society in relation to the Congress, is the speed in which things develop. So speed is a major problem in Congress, not only because of the bureaucratic procedures itself, but also because of the intensity of the negotiations and articulations between a multitude of parties. And at the same time, what Lucas mentioned before, the fact that the president does not have a solid block of alignment that moves forward as a block. So whenever we have articulations in the Congress for anything, the president has to convince his own allies to embark into that. So when we get back into normal activity after the coronavirus, the sense of urgency of the economic reforms, they have to be well adjusted between the executive and the legislative. There must be amicable conversations and relations with no attacks coming from the executive to the Congress or vice versa. We need for the executive to try to form a stronger block of alliance inside the Congress, even if they want to advance things further. And finally, what we have to do is that depending on the degree of the damage for the economy, the degree of speed in the responsiveness from the Congress is likely to rise as well.
I think it's go ahead, Lucas.
No, I'd just like to add the two questions that we received regarding the long-term fiscal consolidation to pass fiscal reforms, Susan and Ricardo. Look, I think that this discussion is for next year. We are coronavirus mode 2020. The Congress is already a hard place to pass reforms, to pass constitutional amendments. If you add a layer that this government has an institutional tension with the Congress, it becomes harder. Just on normal terms, passing a constitutional amendment is hard. You have the institutional tension. Then on top of it, you have a government that doesn't have an organized base, a coalition in the traditional forms of the previous administrations. Then you add another layer, the coronavirus, the craziness that the world is facing. Then you add another layer. We have municipal elections this year, or we should have municipal elections this year in October. This makes a perfect storm melt.
And sorry, Lucas, but we also don't know even when the discussions will resume.
Exactly.
The timeline is so cloudy. So we don't know for how long senators will be stuck with the difficult to use apps for remote deliberation in Congress, which further hampers the discussion.
Exactly. So the year, if the coronavirus had never happened, my bet would still be that in 2020 we wouldn't see major changes in reforms. That said, I think that if one bill were to be approved this year, the one that I find the most realistic bill, which I know there is support from Rodrigo Maia and some leaders, is the fiscal emergency bill. I think that this is something that is more realistic. Regarding tax reform, I think tax reform, it's very realistic to say that it's a debate for 2021 with changes, and I would say watered down changes towards a simplification, not a super revamp, towards the end of 2021. I think the reformist mindset of this Congress, I think the markets sometimes tend to make to be polarized regarding if they are or not reformists. I remember when Bolsonaro was elected, I was seeing excitement among some people in the market that Petrobras would now be a free company to operate as a company, not as a electoral attaché to the administration like it was under the Dilma administration. And then in the first quarter of last year, I remember Bolsonaro made remarks regarding reducing the gas prices, and the stock of Petrobras went downhill very quickly. I remember calling a couple of clients and saying, look, Petrobras under Bolsonaro, and even under any government that has a more liberal economic agenda, will never be a PDVSA-like company, like we see in Venezuela, nor will be an Equinor, a state-owned company in Norway, where it's a super free company to operate. We will have ups and downs, but I am optimistic because I think the ups will be more than the downs. I think when we zoom out and see the big picture, it will be more a company that will be free to operate than used politically by the government. I think the Congress is the same thing. We will see populist approaches. We will see issues of fiscal irresponsibility. But I think on the long run, this Congress has shown, at least in the recent 3-4 years, its reformist mindset, at least on the big picture. We've had labor reform, outsourcing, telecom reform, opening of the oil and gas to the private sector and to foreign IOCs. We have the pension reform, the economic freedom provisional measure. So changes are coming, but it's a slow Congress. It's a fragmented Congress. It's a powerful Congress. And just to finalize, I think that this year will be coronavirus, and maybe being a little bit optimistic, maybe the fiscal emergency bill.
Thank you, Lucas. I see that we're running out of time, and I think it would be very worthwhile for us to end this discussion on the issue of foreign policy. There are many dynamics at play. There is trade, there's cooperation specifically regarding medical equipment, there's intellectual property concerns, and there's also diplomacy concerns. Brazil has notoriously had a kind of a disjointed approach to China specifically, where we can have the healthcare minister on the phone with the Chinese government working on cooperation, and at the same time we have either sons of the president or our minister of education actively picking fights with the country on Twitter. So I'd like to direct this specific subject to Thiago, who is a specialist in Brazil-Chinese diplomatic relations. And could you break down what the situation is between Brazil and China right now?
Well, Michael, the situation between Brazil and China is probably a misunderstanding of the depth of the dependency that one has on the other. In the Brazilian eyes towards China, they understand that China is dependent on the exports from Brazil there, particularly on the soybeans. And that in a certain way, the dependency of China of buying Brazilian soybeans protects in a certain manner even the erratic behavior of damaging this relationship. On the other way around, the Chinese, they look at Brazil and they see that Brazil is dependent on their acquisitions of soybeans, and that Brazil is not the exclusive place where they could find this and buy. So there's a general and very deep miscommunication between the two sides in understanding what's going on, that it's very natural. It would be natural 15 years ago, before China had this magnitude of relationship with Brazil, but it's not natural today. And as you well said, we have areas of the government working to strengthen the relationship, and areas of the government working to generate friction in the relationship in order to justify a different segment of opinion or a different view of a particular situation. I think to understand clearly the Chinese approach towards Brazil, they have specific goals towards Brazil. So when they look at the Ministry of Infrastructure, for example, they look at the Ministry of Infrastructure with the goal of partnership and cooperation in order to try to replicate what they have done in other countries of having a major participation in infrastructure projects in the country. When they look at the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Mines and Energy, they work there to develop the dependency that they believe that they have, that Brazil has over them in the commercial flux of our two largest exports, the agro products plus the mining products as well. When they look at the Ministry of Economy, their narrative with the Ministry of Economy is basically to link the commercial dependency to economic fundamentals and use the Ministry of Economy as a major ally for them in order to defend in the last stage of the decision-making the positions of the president towards China. Also, they have a major goal to guarantee opportunities. They work this particularly in the presidential palace and in the correlated specific ministries, such as the Huawei issue, for example, who will participate in the 5G bidding in the beginning of 2021. And ultimately, to understand the decision-making process in Brazil, which is not only a Chinese goal, but is the goal of every single country and the goal of every single client of ours as well. So understanding what China wants, Brazil could manage these expectations and adopt a posture that, whether it's positive or negative, I'm not going to go into the merit of that, the fact that it's not a unified behavior is something that creates more confusion than anything else.
Thank you for that, Thiago. I actually have several follow-up questions, not only on the issue of foreign policy, but a lot of the other discussions that we've had. But we're running out of time. I think it would be helpful if we organized another one of these webinars for our clients. So to our viewers, please keep an eye out for more information on our upcoming webinars. And then just as a reminder, next week we will have the leader of the government in Congress, Senator Eduardo Gomes, on Monday, and then on Tuesday, former President Michel Temer. These will be in Portuguese, but if you are a Arko client that is based abroad and you would like some summaries or information from those interviews, please let us know and we'll get back to you. So thank you to the viewers. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Thiago.
Thank you.
That will do it for this episode. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.